Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to our read-along of Mr. Scarborough's Family by Anthony Trollope. We are getting close to the halfway point. When we are about a little closer to the halfway point of this book, I'm going to start to rattle all your cages for what our next read-aloud will be. But for right now, we are thickly ensconced in this novel, and we are following young Harry Annesley, of the wavy hair and the dreamy face and the somewhat weak-charactered lips, who has gone back home. He's gone back down to Boston. He's given up his lodgings in the city because his future looks a little bleak. We are watching him batter between highs and lows emotionally. The highs are that he has received a letter from his intended, Florence Mountjoy, who is currently basically being kept prisoner in Brussels. We're going to get to that soon. Telling him that she will never desert him, that she loves him no matter what the world says. And the lows are coming about because of what the world says, because Augustus Scarborough, Mountjoy Scarborough's seedy, serpentine brother, has been spreading around the knowledge that Mountjoy Scarborough and Harry Annesley met late at night on the day that Mountjoy learned that Mr. Scarborough, his father, had declared him illegitimate to the world, and came to blows, and that Harry left Mountjoy insensate on the pavement, after which Mountjoy disappears. So the whole of the city is wondering what happened to Mountjoy Scarborough, and someone knows, at least knows more than he's saying. Those rumors have reached Uncle Prosper, Harry Annesley's landed minor gentry uncle, who owns Buston Place and Buston Park and the farms attached to it, and who is unmarried. Uncle Prosper sent Harry to school, paid for him, gave him an allowance, and let it be known that Harry need not train for a profession like a lawyer or whatever, because he would inherit Buston Place, Buston Hall, because he would be Uncle Prosper's heir. But Uncle Prosper has recently heard these rumors, and he wasn't really all that pleased with Harry to begin with, and has changed his mind, as we've seen in the last couple of hilarious chapters. Uncle Prosper has gone a-courting, trying to find a wife and have a male heir. If he has that, then the entail he put on his property means nothing. Of course, the property goes to the male heir. Which would cut Harry out completely and leave him penniless on the world. Harry is now down at Buston, at the home of his father, the rector, and also his mother, who is Uncle Prosper's sister. And our chapter today is called Mr. Harkaway, and it is a break from a lot of that. Because, yes, Harry is flying between emotional highs and emotional lows, but he's still got to do something with his time. He's not a reader. He's got to do something with his time. And the something that he does here in chapter 28 is a fox hunt. It's a signature item of Trollope fiction. Let's see what he gets up to here. When the first Monday in November came, Harry was still living at Directory. Indeed, what other home had he in which to live? Other friends had become shy of him because of his uncle. He had been accustomed to receive many invitations. Young men who are the heirs of properties and are supposed to be rich because they are idle do get themselves asked about here and there and think a great deal of themselves in consequence. There's young Jones. He's fairly good-looking, but hasn't a word to say for himself. He will do to pair off with Miss Smith, who'll talk for a dozen. When you were in the olden days, when you were setting up parties like this, it very much mattered whether or not Jones or Smith had talk, was how it was put. Do they have conversation? Or are they just going to sit there? And plenty of people got invited to plenty of parties. Plenty of men got invited to plenty of parties, even though the men looked horrible because they had talk. Excellent talk. So it wasn't nothing. It didn't mean nothing. But anyway, let's hear this example more of young Jones. He can't hit a haystack, but he's none the worse for that. We haven't got too many peasants. He'll be sure to come when you ask him, and he'll be sure to go. So Jones is asked and considers himself to be the most popular man in London. I will not say that Harry's invitations had been exactly that description, but he too had considered himself to be popular, and now greatly felt the withdrawal of such remarks of friendship. He had received one put off from the Inglebys of Kent. Early in June he had promised to be there in November. The youngest, Miss Inglesby, was very pretty, and he, no doubt, had been gracious. She knew that he meant nothing, could have meant nothing, but he might come up and mean something, and had been. He might come up to mean something, and had been most pressingly asked. In September, there came a letter to him to say that the room intended for him at Inglesby had been burnt down. Mrs. Inglesby was so extremely sorry, and so were the girls. Harry could trace it all up. The Inglesby knew the Greens, and Mrs. Green was sister to Septimus Jones, who was absolutely the slave, as Harry said, repeating the word to himself with emphasis, of Augustus Scarborough. He was very unhappy, not that he cared in the least for Miss Inglesby, but that he began to be conscious that he was to be dropped. It's a horrible feeling as you try to trace back where is this poison seeping in from and how many people are going to be affected. Cancel culture. He was to be taken up, on the other hand, by Joshua Thoroughbung, that is, his prospective brother-in-law. Alas, alas, though he smiled and resolved to accept the brother-in-law with a good heart, this did not in the least solve the wound. His own country was to him less than other county. His own county was less to him than other counties, and his own neighborhood less than other neighborhoods. Buntington was full of Thoroughbungs, and the best people in the world, but not quite up to what he believed to be his mark. Mr. Prosper himself was the stupidest ass. At Welvin, people smelt of the city. At Stevenage, the parson's set began. Mr. Baldock was a caput mortuum of dullness. Royston was alive only on market days. Of his own father's house and even his mother's and sisters, he entertained ideas that savored a little of depreciation. So the gist of all of these details is that he's looking around at all of his neighbors and everything that it might be anything, and finding them all wanting. There's no place to go, there's nothing to do, there's nobody to see when you get there. But to redeem him from this fault, a fault which would have led to the absolute ruin of his character had it not been redeemed and at last cured, there was a consciousness of his own vanity and weakness. Good to alleviate it, because if this word got out, no one would have anything to do with Harry. And then what do you do? Out in the country. I don't know how many of you live in the country or ever have lived in the country, but you've got to get along with your neighbors. My sister is worth a dozen of them, and my mother and sister 24, he would say of the Inglesby when he went to bed in the room which was to be burned down in preparation for his exile. And he believed it. They were honest. They were unselfish. They were unpretending. His sister Molly was not above owning that her young brewer was all the world to her, the fine, honest, bouncing girl who said her prayers with meaning, thanked the Lord for giving her Joshua, and laughed so loud that you could hear her out of the rectory garden half across the park. Harry knew that they were good, did in his heart know that where the parsons begin, the good things were likely to begin also. He was in this state of mind, the hand of good pulling one way and the devil's pride the other, when young Thoroughbung called on him one morning to carry him on to the Cumberlow Green. Cumberlow Green was a popular meet in that county, where meets have not much to make them popular except the good humor of those who form the hunt. By a meet, we're talking about fox hunting. A bunch of guys get together on horseback to hunt and kill a fox with a pack of dogs. It is not a county either pleasant or easy to ride over, and a Puckeridge fox is surely the most ill-mannered of foxes. But the Puckeridge men are gracious to strangers, and fairly so among themselves. It is more than can be said of Leicestershire, where sportsmen ride in brilliant boots and breeches, but with their noses turned supernaturally into the air. Come along, we've 4 miles to do, and only 20 minutes to do it in. Hello, Molly, how do you do? Come up to the step and give us a kiss. That's Joshua Thoroughbung saying that. Go away, said Molly, rushing back into the house. Did you ever hear anything like his impudence? Why shouldn't you? Said Kate. All the world knows it. Then the gig and the 2 sportsmen was driven on. Don't you think he looks handsome in his pink coat? Whispered Molly afterwards to her elder sister. Only think, I have never seen him in a red coat since he was my own. Last April, when the hunting was over, he hadn't spoken out, and this is the first day he has worn pink this year. So she's marking the time since he proposed. Harry, when he reached the meet, looked about him to watch how he was received. There are not many more painful things in life than when an honest, gallant young fellow has to look about him in such a frame of mind. Yeah, that's well put. Someone in Harry's position, you expect will go to any gathering, a meet or a dance or a rout or anything, and just assume that people are happy to see them. But there's a rumor going around. That's the problem here. There's the poison of Augustus Scarborough. Who knows who he's talked to? Who knows who's connected to who he's talked to? It might have been worse had he deserved to be dropped, someone will say. Not at all. A different condition of mind exists then, and a struggle is made to overcome the judgment of men, which is not in itself painful. It is part of the natural battle of life, which does not hurt one at all, unless indeed the man hate himself for that which has brought upon him the hatred of others. Repentance is always an agony, and should be so. Like you've ever repented of anything, Tony. Without the agony, there can be no repentance. And even then, it is hardly so sharp as that feeling of injustice which accompanies the unmeaning look, the dumb faces, the pretended indifference of those who have condemned. When Harry descended from the gig, he found himself close to old Mr. Harkaway, the master of hounds. Mr. Harkaway was a gentleman who had been master of these hounds for more than 40 years, and had given as much satisfaction as the county could produce. His hounds, which were his hobby, were perfect. All hounds are perfect. His horses were good enough for the Hertfordshire lanes and Hertfordshire hedges. His object was not so much to run a fox as to kill him in obedience to certain rules of the game. Ever so many hindrances have been created to bar the killing of a fox. As for... Uh-oh. We have to pause our reading here. Oh, goodness gracious. Are you going to do this again, baby? Are you going to go over to the chair and then immediately regret your decision? Is that what you're going to do? Baby, I am not over there. You're just going to want to come back here. I am not over there. All right, we'll wait. Expect another interruption. Let's go back to where we were here. Let's see here. His horses were good enough for the Hertfordshire lanes and Hertfordshire hedges. His object was not so much to run a fox as to kill him in obedience to certain rules of the game. Ever so many hindrances had been created to bar the killing of a fox, as for instance that you shouldn't knock him on the head with a brickbat, all of which had to Mr. Harkaway the force of a religion. The laws of hunting are so many that most men who hunt cannot know them all. But no law had ever been written, or had ever become by a law by strength of tradition, which he did not know. To break them was to him treason. When a young man broke them, he pitied the young man's ignorance and endeavored to instruct him after some rough fashion. Hunts, meets, even in the late 20th century, let alone the 1880s. I won't say always, almost always they have this kind of rule quoting martinet. Almost always there's somebody who's just in charge, and suddenly you're at work. You're at a workplace. I've experienced this firsthand. I am pretty sure this is the only time you will ever have this scene in a Trollope novel read to you by someone who has been on fox hunts. When an old man broke them, he regarded him as a fool who should stay at home, or as a traitor who should be dealt with as such. And with such men he could deal very hardly. 40 years of reigning had taught him to believe himself to be omnipotent, and he was so in his own hunt. He was a man who never much affected social habits. The company of one or two brother sportsmen to drink a glass of port wine with him and then early to bed was the most of it. He had a small library, but not a book ever came off the shelf unless it referred to farriers or to res fanatica, to matters of game deals. He was unmarried. The time which other men gave to their wives and families he bestowed upon his hounds. To his stables he never went, looking on a horse as a necessary adjunct to hunting, expensive, disagreeable, and prone to get you into danger. I agree. When anyone flattered him about his horse, he would only grunt and turn his head to one side. No one in these latter days had seen him jump any fence, yet he was always with his hounds, and when anyone said a kind word as to their doings, he would take that as a compliment. It was they who were there to do the work of the day, which horses and men could only look at. He was a sincere, honest, taciturn, and withal affectionate man, who could on occasion be very angry with those who offended him. He knew well what he could do, and never attempted that which was beyond his power. I might point out here, the horses on a fox hunt do a lot more than just spectate. It's not the hounds who are taking those hedges, 6 feet tall, with maybe water or rocks behind them. How are you, Mr. Harkaway? Said Harry. How are you, Mr. Hensley? How are you? Said the master, with all the grace with which he was capable. But Harry caught a tone in his voice which he thought implied displeasure. And Mr. Harkaway had in truth heard the story, how Harry had been discarded at Buston because he had knocked a man down in the streets at night time, and had then gone away. After that, Mr. Harkaway toddled off, and Harry sat and frowned with an embittered heart. Well, Malton Hops, how are you doing? This came from a fast young banker who lived in the neighborhood and who thus intended to show his familiarity with the brewer. But when he saw Ainsley, he turned around and rode away. Scaly trick that fellow played the other day. He knocked a fellow down, and when he thought he was dead, he lied about it like old boots. All of which made itself intelligible to Harry. He told himself that he had always hated that banker. "Why do you let such a fellow as that call you malt and hops?" he said to Joshua. Joshua being a brewer. What, young foreign? He's a good fellow and doesn't mean anything. A vulgar cad, I should say. And he rode on in silence till he was addressed by an old gentleman of the country who had known his father for the last 30 years. The old gentleman had nothing about him to recommend him either to Harry's hatred or love till he spoke, and after that Harry hated him. "How do you do, Mr. Ainsley?" said the old gentleman, and then rode on. Harry knew that the old man had condemned him as the others had done, or he would never have called him Mr. Ainsley. He felt that he was blown upon in his county as well as by the Inglesbys down in Kent. Is our boy imagining some of this? You never know. It could be some of it. Certainly not all of it. They had but a moderate day's sport, going in considerable distance in search of it, till an incident arose which gave quite an interest to the field generally, and nearly brought Joshua Thoroughbrung into a scrape. They were drawing a cover when which was undoubtedly the property of their own hunt, or rather just going to draw it, when all of a sudden they became aware that every hound in the pack was hunting. Mr. Harkaway at once sprang from his usual cold, apathetic manner into full action, and they who knew him well could see that it was not excitement of joy. He was in an instant full of life, but it was not the life of successful enterprise. He was perturbed and unhappy, and his huntsman, Dillon, a silent, cunning, not very popular man, who would obey his master in everything, began to move about rapidly and to be at his wits' end. The younger men prepared themselves for a run, one of those short, decisive spurts which come in the spur of the moment, and in which a man, if he is not quite awake to the demands of the moment, is very apt to be left behind. Because when the dogs take off, when they go into full bell and take off, you've got to take off after them. And the whole hunt can go that way. And I admit, if it's broad open countryside with maybe a little wood on one side, a little wood on the other, maybe a stream coming up, maybe some fences, it can be thrilling. It can be thrilling. Do that on a nice, bright, sunny day, it can be thrilling. But the old stagers had their eye on Mr. Harkaway and knew that there was something amiss. Then there appeared another field of hunters, first one man leading them, then others following, and then after them the first ruck, and then the crowd. It was apparent to all who knew anything that two packs had joined. These were the Hitchiners, as the rival sportsmen would call them, and this was the Hitchin Hunt, with Mr. Fairlawn their master. Mr. Fairlawn was also an old man, popular no doubt in his own county, but by no means beloved by Mr. Harkaway. Mr. Harkaway used to declare how Mr. Fairlawn had behaved very badly about certain common covers about 30 years ago, when the matter had to be referred to a committee of masters. No one in these modern days knew aught of the quarrel or cared. The men of the two hunts were very good friends, unless they met under the joint eyes of the two masters, and then they were supposed to be bound to hate each other. Now the two packs were mixed together, and there was only one fox between them. The fox did not trouble them long. He could hardly have saved himself from one pack, but very soon escaped from the fangs of two. Each hound knew that his neighbor hound was a stranger, and in scrutinizing the singularity of the occurrence, lost all power of hunting. In 10 minutes, there were nearly 40 couples of hounds running hither and thither, with 2 huntsmen and 4 whips swearing at them with strange voices, and 2 old gentlemen giving orders each in opposition to each other. Then each pack was got together, almost on the same ground, and it was necessary that something should be done. Well, if you've got 2 packs merged together and they can't concentrate on hunting because they're concentrating on each other, and you want order, you could always tell them to separate themselves and behave, sit down and be quiet. Oh, wait, you can't. Hounds, masters. I laughed at it decades ago, and I laugh at it now. There's only one creature on 2 legs on this planet that can call himself a hound master. Anyway, Mr. Harkaway waited to see whether Mr. Fairlawn should ride away quickly to his own country. He would not have spoken to Mr. Fairlawn if he could have helped it. Mr. Fairlawn was some miles away from his country. He must have given up the day for lost had he simply gone away. But there was another cover a mile off, and he thought that one of his hounds had shown a line, or said that he thought so. Now, it is well known that you may follow a hunted fox through whatever country he may take you to, but only if your hounds are hunting him continuously. In other words, you can't go into somebody else's property or somebody else's hunting grounds on a whim or a theory. You have to be in full throat. You have to be moving. And they're not moving. Both of these hunts have stopped. And one hound that for that purpose is as good as 30. And if a hound can only show a line, he is held to be hunting. Mr. Fairlawn was quite sure that one of his hounds had been showing a line and had been whipped off it by one of Mr. Harkaway's men. The man swore that he had only been collecting his own hounds. On this plea, Mr. Fairlawn demanded he take his whole pack to Greasegate Wood, and the very covert that Mr. Harkaway had been about to draw. "Well, I'm damned if I do," said Mr. Harkaway, standing whip in hand in the middle of the road, so as to prevent the enemy huntsman passing by with his hounds. It was afterward declared that Mr. Harkaway had not been heard to curse or swear for the last 15 years. "I'm damned if I don't," said Mr. Fairlawn, riding up to him. Mr. Harkaway was 10 years the older man, and looked as though he had much less of fighting power, but no one saw him quail or give an inch. Those who watched his face declared his lips were white with rage and quivered with passion. Who's going to do this? I guarantee you Trollope saw something like this in his own fox hunting experiences. I guarantee you he did. To tell the words which passed between them after that would require Homer's pathos and Homer's imagination. The two old men scowled and scolded at each other, and had Mr. Fairlawn attempted to pass, Mr. Harkaway would certainly have struck him with his whip. And behind their master, a crowd of the Puckeridge men collected themselves, foremost among them Joshua Thoroughbung. "Take him round to the cover by Winnipeg Lane," said Mr. Fairlawn to his huntsman. The man prepared to take his pack round by Winnipeg Lane, which would have added a mile to the distance. But the huntsman, when he got a little to the left, was soon seen scurrying across the country in the direction of the cover, with a dozen others at his heel, and the hounds following him. But old Mr. Harkaway had seen it too, and having possession of the road, galloped along it at such a pace that no one could pass him. All the field declared that they had regarded it as impossible that the master should move so fast. And Dillon and the Whips and the Thoroughbung and Harry Ainsley and half a dozen others kept pace with him. They would not sit there and see their master outmaneuvered by any lack of readiness on their part. They got to the cover first, and there, with their whips drawn, were ready to receive the second pack. Then one hound went in without order, but for their own hounds they did not care. They might find a fox and go after him, and nobody would follow them. The business here at the covert side was more important and more attractive. Then it was that Mr. Thoroughbung nearly fell into danger. As to the other hounds, Mr. Fairlawn's hounds doing any harm in the cover and doing any good for themselves or their owners, that was out of the question. The rival pack was already there, with their noses up in the air and thinking of anything but a fox, and this other pack, the Hitchiners, was just as wild. But it was the object of Mr. Fairlawn's bodyguard to say that they had drawn the cover in the teeth of Mr. Harkaway, and to achieve this, one of the Whips thought that he could ride through the Puckeridge men, taking a couple of hounds with him. That would suffice for a triumph. All this confusion, because you can't simply say to the dogs what you want them to do. But to prevent such triumph on the part of the enemy, Joshua Thoroughbung was prepared to sacrifice himself. He rode right at the Whip, with his own whip raised, and would undoubtedly have ridden over him, had not the Whip tried to turn his horse sharp round, stumbled, and fallen in the struggle, and had not Thoroughbung, with his horse, fallen over him. Very serious. This is very serious. Keep in mind, basically there is no medicine in the 1880s. Basically there is no medicine. If you fall and your horse, 2,000 pounds, falls on top of you, it happens often in Trollope that someone will be grievously hurt. It will be the case that a slight danger or injury in one direction will often stop a course of action calculated to create greater dangers and worse injuries. So it was in this case. With Dick, the Hitchins' whip went down, and Thoroughbung, with his horse, was over him, the two men and horses struggling together on the ground. All desire to carry on the fight was over. The huntsman came up, and the last Mr. Fairlawn also, and considered it to be their duty to pick up Dick, whose breath was knocked out of him by the weight of Joshua Thoroughbung, and the Puckeridge side felt it to be necessary to give their aid to the valiant brewer. There was then no more attempt to draw the cover. Each general in gloomy silence took off his forces, and each afterward deemed that the victory was his. Dick swore, when brought to himself, that one of his hounds had gone in, whereas Squire Harkaway had swore most horrid oaths that no Hitchiner should ever live to put his nose in. One of his hounds at a Squire Harkaway would have been, you know. Well, Dick declared that he would not say what would happen to Mr. Harkaway. So there you go. That is a fox hunting scene of a kind. The fox is not in any danger because we have an unplanned meeting of two meets, and two rival potentates, two rival masters of the hounds. A total digression of a scene, totally. Trollope knows what his readers want. He knows that if he's got his characters out in the countryside, going from country house to country house, from rectory to rectory, he's got to include fox hunting. As far as our storyline goes, the only thing really germane here, aside from giving us a little more of a glimpse of what Joshua Thoroughbung is made of, but we already liked him. The only real inroad here to the story is to give us a sense of this poison seeping through the land, attaching to the name of Harry Ainsley, and that he knows it, and that it's making him darker of mood, bitterer. He doesn't know where he's going to encounter it, but it's having widespread effect. People in the countryside know about this story, about him leaving a man for dead on the sidewalk, and they don't like it. That's done right at the beginning of the chapter and never mentioned again. So this is an indulgence on Trollope's part, and it's just an indulgence. He's not going to continue with it. We will move on to an element of the story proper next time, an element that we have been neglecting for a bit. We will move on to that next time, and I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.